Okay, and I'm making a point to record. I'm so glad I remembered. Now I just automatically set it to record. As you all know, I had forgotten to do that the last time. But yes, just really eager and excited to learn from Amy. And she is a psychiatrist practicing in Maryland. I'm just really grateful that she's volunteered her time today to just give us knowledge about intensives from her experience. I think she's just so generous with her time and her heart in that way. And Amy has made the big jump of actually letting go of a practice that did some medication management to actually solely focusing on treating patients through intensive therapy, which I think is just a really brave step to take and an amazing jump. Like it's just a unique way to practice that I don't think has been available to many people. So I've actually found Amy to be just one of the most skillful therapists I've had the privilege to work with. She would never admit that because she's super humble and maybe even feeling a bit embarrassed that I'm sharing that, but that's the honest truth. I've met with her. We first met through the Atlanta Intensive and then have just become friends since. And then she was in my consultation group and we've just connected in the past couple of years. And she just, in addition to being super skillful, just has this natural, genuine warmth, a genuine compassion for others, truly cares about the human being. And that's just really evident in my interactions with her. And just a little bit more background information on Amy as well, so y'all could know how cool she is. She completed medical school and a psychiatry residence at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. And she's been in private practice since 2010, but really actually fell in love with therapy and specifically CBT as a resident. And for several years, she even directed the training at Johns Hopkins for residents in CBT. But I think her life changed in 2019 when she discovered TEAM-CBT, which I think for many of us, it started to transform us as human beings, transformed our practice. And she also expressed the same, that it has transformed her practice as well. And she's now level 3 certified in TEAM-CBT, incorporates the team model in all of her work, even though she draws on a variety of different methods from different schools of therapy. She's just dedicated to continually exploring and learning new ways to operate, new methods. And just from knowing Amy, she really is a lifelong learner, like truly curious, truly wanting to continue to soak in new things. And she has had some training in ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy, in DBT, rumination focus, exposure response prevention therapy, mindfulness-based self-compassion, which I know Dr. Burns kind of poo-poos on, but I think is wonderful. I also really love mindfulness and find it to be powerful. And most recently, even internal family systems, so just very well-rounded in her studies, but really integrates the team model with all of those methods. And so without further ado, Amy, let me hand it to you and you can begin. Really eager and excited to learn from you here.
Okay, yeah, welcome everybody. I'm going to see if I can manage to pull up my PowerPoint. Let's see.
And hopefully I've done the settings right. I'm feeling a bit anxious about that too. I've done it to where everyone could screen share, so hopefully that works. Okay.
Yeah. Is that working for everyone? Okay, let's see. And okay, are we set? Everyone can see? Yeah, so I decided to call this presentation Doing Intensives What I've Learned Along the Way, because, you know, as Tyann shared with me that, you know, she was doing this intensive and didn't have any experience, I realized I had no experience or training in how to do an intensive when I started out. So I've been making lots of mistakes and learning from them. and that's actually why I chose this picture for the first slide of Michelle Kwan falling at the Olympics. I recently learned of a study that was done in looking at which ice skaters go on to win the gold at the Olympics. And the hypothesis was that it would be time spent on ice. So that, they thought probably the more time spent on ice, the more likely someone is to win the gold. And what they found was that there was actually basically no correlation between time spent on ice and who went on to win the gold, but there was a strong correlation between number of falls. So the more number of falls an ice skater had while training, the more likely they were to win the gold. I think sort of the gold that I have to share with you comes from all of the mistakes I've made along the way. Okay. So I know Tyann gave a little introduction, but I also wanted to sort of give my own little introduction to share a little bit about me and sort of the context in which I came to do what I'm doing now. I'm the mom of a wonderful 10-year-olds, and also the spouse of a wonderful person from Russia, and also a maverick at heart, I would say. Always sort of skeptical of everything new, but also love to learn new things. So I really value sort of independent thinking. And I think that's one of the things that sort of led me to try out this new thing in my practice. As Tyann mentioned, I was trained as a psychiatrist and really sort of trained in this medical model of, people with anxiety or depression, have illnesses, and it's our duty as psychiatrists to sort of fix the problem with medications. And also to tell them, we know what they should do. We should make the diagnosis and tell them what they need to do to get better, and they should do it. This was really the message I received in my training. There was a lot of that didn't sit right with me from the beginning. But I've found that over the last 11 years that I've had in private practice, I've gradually been dropping one more vestige of that after another to get to the place where I am now. At this point, after more than 10 years of meeting with people regularly and managing medications. Since January 2021, I've been almost entirely meeting with people just intensively, meaning, brief, maximum 2 weeks duration of treatment, and 2 to 4 hours a day. I do still have a few weekly patients from my previous practice, people I felt like I was in the middle of important stuff with. And I have to admit that that's actually been helpful in terms of having a little bit of stability of income, to have a few people that I'm seeing regularly. And as Tyann mentioned, sort of since I made this switch, I've actually stopped prescribing medication. So I want to share a little bit more about sort of how I came to make this switch. The following slide tells the story a bit. As Tyann shared, in 2019, I discovered TEAM-CBT. And I realize that there are a few of you present here who are maybe not familiar with TEAM-CBT. So I'm going to give you a little explanation of that on the next slide. But one aspect of TEAM-CBT is that it allows for sort of more rapid treatment. So David Burns manages to really help people recover fully from pretty severe anxiety and depression in 2-hour sessions regularly. I've never gotten anywhere near that. But when I went to the Atlanta intensive in 2019 and saw Tyann and David Burns work with a man who'd had really debilitating social anxiety for much of his life, and then saw how he actually, and we got some follow-up hearing how it really changed his life. That 1-2-hour session, that made me think I could do things differently from the way I'm doing them now. I had patients I'd been seeing for the entire duration of my private practice who really weren't getting better. I was sort of giving empathy every week, and they weren't getting better. So discovering sort of the rapid recoveries that David Burns is capable of made me think maybe there's another way to do this. Some other inspirations to me in this were, I discovered the work of Lars Ost. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. He's Swedish. He, among other things, developed a 1-session treatment for phobias. So it's actually not really 1 session, because he has a 1-hour initial evaluation and a 1-hour follow-up. But in the middle, there's a 3-hour exposure treatment session in which he works with people to overcome phobias. And he's had really good success at helping people overcome phobias and in a durable way with these 1-session treatments. And then I think this was also 2019, the International OCD Foundation Conference. I went to a talk by some people from Norway who had developed something they call the Bergen 4-day treatment. And it's basically a 4-day treatment for OCD. So it's actually a half day of sort of group sort of psychoeducation, and a half day of follow-up, and then in between, or a half day of sort of relapse preparation. And in between, there are 2 full 8-hour days of one-on-one patient and therapist doing exposure for those 2 8-hour days. And they've had amazing responses, really getting people a lot better in 4 days. And so hearing about all of those things, inspired me to think, maybe I could do this. Maybe I don't have to work with people for 10 years and could actually help people feel better faster. And yeah. So that combined with the pandemic happening and having a 10-year-old or then 9-year-old at home, and realizing that it was just not sustainable to keep seeing, 8 patients a day, I couldn't do it. I needed to change things around. And I thought, sort of, what better opportunity to try this thing that I've been wanting to do. So I sort of jumped in without knowing anything. And I'll share with you what I've learned. So, right, for those of you who don't know TEAM-CBT, I'm going to refer to various things related to it as we go. So I thought I'd just say briefly that it's really a way of structuring therapy. It has 4 really important components. And those components are testing, which includes getting measures of positive and negative feelings and the therapeutic alliance before and after every single session in order to measure progress and help understand the experience of the people we're working with. It's not just, checking a scale at the beginning of treatment and at the end of treatment, but really getting feedback every time we meet with patients so that we can adjust along the way. It also involves, teachable empathy skills that help us connect with the people we work with, and a real emphasis on sort of measuring the empathy that's part of the testing of the therapeutic alliance. We're sort of seeing how we are doing with understanding the people we work with, and sort of learning from them as to how we can understand them better. The A in TEAM is for assessment of resistance, and also sometimes originally it was for paradoxical agenda setting. And that involves tools to help us align with an individual's resistance and enhance motivation to change. And I'll be referring to a number of those tools as we go along. And then the M stands for methods that we use to help people change. And those can actually come from a whole range of schools of therapy. And I certainly draw from lots of different schools when I get to the methods. Okay. So I wanted right from the very beginning to sort of be upfront with you about the limitations of my experience, so that you don't start thinking I have too much experience. So I've seen really a total of 12 people for the full intensive treatment. And you can see the variety of problems that I've helped them with. And also sort of what the total duration of the treatments were for each of them, and the total hours I spent with each of them. And then you can see some outcome measures. The PCL5 that I have here refers to the PTSD checklist. The other measures are all taken from the BMS. Ideally, I'd like to have more specific measures, like for OCD, the Y box pre and post. I am finding it challenging once people sort of are done with the intensive to sort of get their follow-up scores on the different skills. So I'm working on that. but as you can see here, I put in italics that there are a couple of people I worked with here who didn't actually get better at all. In fact, their scores were a little bit worse when they ended the intensive. In fact, the one that I spent the most amount of time with, a total of 26 hours, was one of the ones that did not get better. Even the ones where we see a significant improvement in scores pre and post, I can tell you we're not fully cured, haven't had any full cures yet. So I think basically everyone I've worked with has gone on to benefit from some sort of follow-up, either with me or with someone else. And I'll say more about that when we get to sort of relapse prevention later on. Okay. So before I get to sort of the nitty-gritty of exactly what I do, and to sort of answering some of the more specific questions that many of you sent in to me earlier, I thought I'd share some of the major mistakes that I've made along the way, and sort of what I've learned from them, so that you'll know that as I share sort of what I do, it's all informed by these mistakes that I've made. So a big one, and this is one that I made with that individual with generalized anxiety disorder and claustrophobia that I spent 26 hours with, who didn't get better, was not addressing outcome resistance sufficiently when you're working with someone who appears to be super motivated. So by outcome resistance, for those of you who don't know TEAM, I mean sort of reasons why a person might not actually really want the outcome the result of the change, the outcome that they're working toward in therapy. So for this particular individual, he also was dealing with a lot of perfectionism, and he really sort of wanted to be able to not be anxious, but wasn't quite at a place where he was okay about sort of accepting imperfection. He wanted to sort of get to this place of not being anxious by being, doing things right, getting them right. And I got sort of sidetracked when I started, when I first met with him, because he appeared so motivated. He'd read, several books by the time we first met. He'd done lots of homework. And I was thinking, wow, like he really wants to change. And so I sort of, I did a little bit of positive reframing of the anxiety and the perfectionism with him, but sort of skimped on it. And I think that was a big mistake, because I really sort of failed to miss how much he really sort of wasn't ready to go to that place of sort of accepting himself as not perfect, an imperfect human. And I think that's one of the main reasons that treatment didn't work out. Okay. Another mistake that I've made is not addressing process resistance sufficiently, especially sort of from the very beginning, like in the initial screening. So process resistance is sort of reluctance to do the work that you'd need in order to make change. I had one patient whom I had seen for an initial screening, and she had decided not to work with me. At that point, she was actually having some thoughts of suicide, and was not at a place where she was sort of willing to take that option of suicide off the table. And so she had chosen not to work with me, and then later she sort of reached back out to me and said, you know, I'm willing now to take suicide off the table. And I made the mistake of not sort of doing my full screening process, since I'd sort of already seen her. And later she shared with me that she felt a bit blindsided by the fact that I was sort of asking her to put a lot of work into our work together. That treatment too ended up not going so well, because she really wasn't at a place where she was ready to put in that work. Okay. Another mistake I've made is trying to sell the treatment, especially in response to an individual or family members who are feeling skeptical about it. So I had one patient who, shared with me that she had seen so many different providers and none of them had helped her, and she really wasn't sure that I was going to be able to help her. And I sort of made the mistake of sort of telling her how what I did was different from what everyone else had done, sort of trying to sell her on it. And she did end up working with me, but I think it put her into this position, didn't mean to do that, of sort of forcing her into proving me wrong by not getting better. It was also sort of a major empathy failure that I didn't validate her feelings of hopelessness. Another mistake I've made is not addressing interpersonal issues immediately. So I had the same patient there that I made the mistake of selling the treatment to, managed to figure out how to get around the fact that on my feedback form, it's required to sort of put what you like least about the session and what you like most about the session. So she figured out how to put some spaces in there, so she didn't have to put anything. She figured this out on day 4 of 5 of a 5-day treatment. And I made the mistake of not addressing that, sort of not checking in with her about, what might be going on that she didn't feel comfortable, what I might be doing that led her to not feel comfortable, sort of sharing that. I actually really think that a lot of what the anxiety she was dealing with was related to sort of hidden emotion and sort of not sharing certain emotions. And I think that was a major lost opportunity there. Okay. Right. And this is one of the biggest mistakes, most common mistakes I've made. And that's initially when I started out, sort of, I was giving people this message and myself this message that we would achieve full recovery by the end of the intensive, just like David Burns. That was definitely a big mistake. First of all, it makes it really hard to sit with open hands when you're feeling this pressure that you have to get people better by the end of the time period. And it also makes it really hard to interpret incomplete recovery as anything but a failure, instead of sort of appreciating the recovery that did happen. So I've definitely been learning from that mistake. And then certainly not the last mistake that I've made, but the last one that I'm going to share with you here is not conveying to the individual that I'm working with, nor personally embracing from the very beginning of treatment the philosophy of failing as fast as we can. So, I think when you've got limited time, it's easy to get discouraged when one method that you work with doesn't work out, because you have limited time, and I've certainly made the mistake of sort of thinking, oh, this is going to be the method that helps this person, and then when it doesn't, it can be very discouraging to me, and it can also be really discouraging to the person I'm working with if I haven't sort of prepared them for, you can expect that we're going to have to try a number of different methods, and there's this philosophy in this work of failing as fast as we can in order to sort of get to the methods that are going to work for you. So I've now learned to really share that philosophy from the very beginning, so that people expect, okay, we're going to try a few different methods before we get to something helpful. Okay, finally, we're now going to sort of get to the nitty-gritty of how I actually set up the intensives and carry them out. Again, very much informed by what I've learned along the way. So we'll start with setting up an intensive. So in the survey that I sent out asking people for questions, somebody asked what I do in terms of marketing. I realize that is absolutely not my strong suit. And so if any of you have suggestions for that, I'd love them. But I can share with you what I have done. So I tried putting up a Psychology Today profile. People recommended that I do that, so I gave it a try, and I had it up for 5 months. But for me, it turned out to be sort of a waste of time and money, because I think part of the problem is that I'm a psychiatrist, and so people do these searches for psychiatrists, and they don't actually read the profiles of the people that they search for. So I was getting lots of calls every day for somebody to manage medications, and that's not what I do anymore. So I had to spend a lot of time sort of responding to those calls. And I don't think I actually got a single referral from Psychology Today the whole 5 months of somebody who was looking for what I had to offer. So I stopped paying for that. What's been more successful is I do have some profiles on the websites of the International OCD Foundation, the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, and the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies. And I've gotten a few referrals from those profiles. But my biggest source of referrals has been word of mouth, colleagues and friends who sort of know what I'm doing. And I could probably work on that part too, if I had the time and ambition, but I haven't been very good about that. Right. Lots of people wanted to know sort of how do you figure out who's going to be a good fit for an intensive? And I think some signs that someone may well be a good fit is when you've got someone who's really motivated to make changes sooner rather than later, like doesn't want to have to wait 10 months to feel better. wants to do it now, and especially if they can sort of take some time off from school or work to really focus in and make the changes, that's a great fit. You know, so one of the people I worked with was a woman who was 8 months pregnant and had a fear of blood and injections. And was concerned that she wouldn't be able to get an epidural if she needed one because of her fear. And so she was very motivated to work on this right now. And that was a very successful treatment. It turns out not to be a good fit if you've got someone who, you know, is still actively considering suicide as an option. So that's something I always check with in the initial screening, and, you know, let people know that, you know, if they're considering suicide as an option, it's not a good time to do this work. At some point in the future, if they take that off the table, we can sort of reconnect. Also, if there's an active addiction that would sort of make it hard to do the work, I think it's not a good fit, or some other comorbid problem, for example, active psychosis, that could interfere. And then absolutely, if a person has good reasons sort of not to do the work necessary to achieve change, you know, maybe they're really have too many things on their plate and just feel overwhelmed by that, you know, then it's not going to be a good fit. Okay. So a lot of people also had questions about sort of the financial side of things. As probably lots of you know, unfortunately, insurance reimburses quite poorly for prolonged sessions. You know, I've had some better success getting reimbursement for 2-hour sessions than longer sessions, but a lot of insurance companies won't even reimburse for anything over an hour. So I've had to consider some other options for helping to ease the financial burden for people. So one of those options is payment plans. So I've offered that to some people who find it helpful. Another option is to consider sliding scales. And right now I am trying out sort of reserving a week every month for members of minoritized communities to work with me on a sliding scale basis. So I have to say that although I put this on my website quite a number of months ago, I haven't actually had anyone sort of take me up on that yet. So I think I could use some help with some marketing there. So I can't give you feedback as to how that's going, other than that it's not going. But that's what I'm trying. And then another possibility, which I'm planning to try in the future, I feel that I still need to collect some more data, but that is to sort of meet with, you know, insurance companies to sort of present data to them, showing them that, you know, this is an effective treatment that's going to save them money in the long term, and then it makes sense for them to cover it. Okay. Right. So just maybe I'll let you guys all have these slides. For the sake of time, I'll let you sort of read the details of sort of the policies that I have been working with in terms of timing of payment and reimbursement, etc. Again, these are still sort of works in progress. I'm adjusting things along the way, so different policies might be right for you. Okay. Right, so now I'm just going to go through, when it comes to the setting up process of the intensive, how I incorporate TEAM, T-E-A-M, into that. So we're starting with the T, testing. And so, before I meet with someone for an initial evaluation, I'll have them fill out David Byrne's easy diagnostic interview or scale, which is, sort of a comprehensive screening for lots of different DSM diagnoses. And I find that saves a lot of time. So it alerts me if there's sort of maybe something I wasn't aware of that requires more attention from me. But then it also sort of saves me from having to spend a lot of time on screening in that initial evaluation for sort of other diagnoses. Also, so I'll meet with someone before I sort of schedule them for an intensive for a 30-minute free screening consultation. And at that, sort of when I'm setting that up, before I actually see them for the free screening consultation, I'll ask them to complete a concept of self-help memo. So I've edited David Byrne's concept of self-help memo to sort of fit my own practice. But I still have in there sort of the list of, all of the good reasons not to do self-help assignments. And I find that when I do that from the beginning, that's one really helpful way of sort of assessing where somebody is in terms of process resistance, and sort of setting us up to have a discussion about that. And then also sort of before I start meeting with people, if I know that sort of I'm going to be working with somebody on OCD, I'll have them fill out a Y box, and then similarly, specific scales for whatever it is we're working on, I'll have them complete at the very beginning. In terms of empathy, I want to say, I think, even in the setting up process, empathy just sort of helps with everything else. So it really helps, when you're really connecting with someone to get a better sense of whether they are going to be a good fit, and to sort of pick up on possible, outcome resistance or process resistance that you might not have picked up on if you didn't have that connection with them. Right, in terms of the A, assessment of resistance and agenda setting, so, even when before people reach out to me, I have this video on my website that sort of gives a little introduction of what I do. And even there, I begin to address sort of, people may be pushing them in to seek treatment, and it might not actually be the right time for, they might not be at a place where they're, this is the right time for them. So I begin to address both process and outcome resistance in that video. And then if they want to set up that 30-minute free screening consultation with me, I have them fill out a form to make that request. And on the form, I ask them a few questions that also begin to deal with agenda setting and assessment of resistance. So I ask them basically a miracle cure question of, if we could accomplish a miracle in our work together, what would you want that to be? And then I also, sort of screening again for process resistance, ask them, for the sake of achieving that miracle, would you be willing to face your fears head on? And they've got yes, no, and maybe options there. As I mentioned, I have them fill out the concept of self-help memo before we actually meet for the screening consultation. And then I'm really listening for possible, reasons why they might not actually want the outcome that they're asking for. And so even in that screening consultation, I might sort of use some tools like the acid test or voicing resistance from the very beginning. And I absolutely am going to sort of use the usual tools for addressing process resistance in that initial screening. I'm sorry, I get confused by my new mouse. Right, the final thing is that I always, before we start, ask them to create a wish list. And this is an idea that I stole from Daniel Minty. So he gave me this idea to ask for a wish list of what they would like to be different by the end of the intensive. And I find that's really helpful. Again, it's sort of addressing the miracle cure question even before we meet. Okay. So, right, the final M part of TEAM in the setting up part is that I actually always assign homework even before we meet for the initial evaluation. So I often have people sort of record their thoughts and feelings on a daily mood log. I send them instructions for how to do that. I'll have them complete a log of compulsions or safety behaviors that they've been engaging in, a log of avoided situations. And my choice of these is because I'm working specifically with people who are dealing with anxiety. So this would look different if I were working with someone with depression. I might also have them, I created a worksheet to sort of guide them through the what if technique. I might have them do that in advance. And I might also assign chapters in a book or videos or podcasts for them to look at, depending on what the individual is coming to me for help with. Okay, and just a word about the homework. I feel that really sort of gets us, to a place where we're just ready to jump in when we start the intensive. And it also sort of prepares them for the fact that this is going to take a lot of work. Okay, so now moving on to actually carrying out the intensive, sort of what I do with people while I'm working with them. Was there something? Right. Right. A lot of people asked, is it possible to do intensives by teletherapy? And the answer to that is, most of the time it's quite possible. So almost all the intensives that I've done have been by teletherapy. And I know a lot of people have concerns about doing exposures by teletherapy. There are lots of exposures that I've had good success doing by teletherapy. So, I've had people sort of walk through their homes on their phones or computers, contaminating everything, and sort of taking me with me as they do that. So you can absolutely do, all of these different sorts of exposures effectively by teletherapy. I've done all of these. Some things that I wouldn't be as comfortable doing by teletherapy, don't think would work so well, are things like exposures to animals, blood and needles, exposures while driving, and certain situational exposures where it's sort of hard to stay connected by computer or phone. So the two people that I have worked with live on intensives were the ones with the butterfly phobia and the blood and injection phobia. For both of them, the live work was really important. Okay. Right, moving again through the TEAM, but this time looking at sort of how we're doing it during the intensive. I get the basic mood survey and the evaluation of therapy session before and after each session. And find that it's even more important in an intensive setting than in other settings to notice, any little changes or anything less than a perfect score on the ETS when you're working in that intensive way. And then I'm also going to do sort of relevant within session informal testing. So something, I don't know if Jessica Drobny is here today, but something that she taught me is, so instead of asking people, as David Burns does, to grade them on a sort of A to F scale in terms of empathy, she's been asking people to rate her on a 0 to 10 scale at how well she's doing at understanding their experience. She has found, and I have too since I've started doing this, that people are much more likely to really be honest with you if they're doing it on a 0 to 10 scale. It's more comfortable to give somebody a 6 out of 10 than it is to give them a B or a C. I've been finding that really useful. And then some other things that I'm often testing, within session are sort of motivation at different points in our work together. Obviously in my work with anxiety, I'm asking people to sort of rate their anxiety or their SUDS scores, before, during, and after different interventions. And then, as I mentioned before, sort of after the treatment, I'm trying to get follow up on the same skills that I had them complete at the beginning of treatment, so that I can see the differences there and also have data to present to the insurance companies. Okay. In terms of the E part, empathy, again, I find it so important, especially in the intensive setting, to really pay attention to anything less than an imperfect score on that ETS. And it's never too early either to change the focus. I've even found it helpful pre-treatment at times in this intensive work to really be sure that we're connecting. And so not only does it make treatment, go better and more effective, but it's so rewarding when we connect with the people we're working with. Okay. In terms of the assessment of resistance and agenda setting, a big thing about intensives is it's just really hard to sit with open hands when you have a limited period of time to help somebody. And so I've found that I actively have to, sort of prepare to go in with the intention of slowing down and really remind myself to sit with open hands, slow down, and stay curious and open. And when I do that and really take the time to understand why a person's symptoms make perfect sense, that's when magic happens. But if I'm sort of trying to get them better by the end of the time, that's not going to work. I also just wanted to put in a plug, and I really got this from Tyann. Thank you, Tyann. Is using the triple paradox. So I use that a lot to look at, all of the good reasons to keep engaging in safety behaviors or compulsions. I find that's really helpful. in terms of addressing both outcome and process resistance there. Okay. I think maybe somebody is unmuted. I don't know if it's possible.
Sorry about that, Amy. I was trying to mute everyone and accidentally muted you as well.
Okay, I figured out how to unmute myself even while I still had my PowerPoint up. Okay. Right, so the last part of the TEAM again is methods, and again it's so important especially in the setting of intensives to have that philosophy of fail as fast as you can, and I find that I have to really beware of getting too attached to one particular method. I also find that methods are much more likely to succeed if I am willing to tailor the method to the individual rather than trying to get the individual to fit the method. So I'm constantly sort of making new worksheets or creating new methods to fit the person. And then I've already shared that I use sort of lots of methods beyond David Burns's 50 Ways to Untwist Your Thinking. I love his methods, and there are lots of other methods that I find really helpful too. Okay, right. So, at the end of the intensive, it's so important, I've found, to make sure I leave enough time, at least an hour, sometimes more is necessary, for relapse prevention and follow-up planning. So what I've come to, again through my learning from my mistakes, is that and this idea I actually took from Lars Ost, who does this with his one session treatments with phobias, is I have people basically create a plan for the next 6 months, detailing exposures and or other skills that they're going to practice. And I create a form with them for tracking their practice month by month. And then I ask them to send me that form with sort of recording what they've done each month at the end of the month, so that they can stay accountable. So I think for some people, like especially with the phobias, that sort of follow-up is sort of all they need, is to be able to send me in these forms and stay accountable in that way. And for others, they might need more follow-up than that. But that would be sort of the minimal amount of follow-up I would want to leave someone with, would be asking them to send in those forms to me every 6 months, plus a plan for what to do when a slip or relapse happens. So we always make a plan for that, and and it includes, if they try everything on the list and it's not helping, that they'll reach out to me. So we can either have a sort of a booster session, or if it looks like they might need some more regular follow-up, I'll refer them to somebody for that. So when I'm doing teletherapy, I will record sessions, and I'll actually have them record the sessions on their computer, so that they have those as resources for maintaining their gains, and also going back to, at times of setbacks, and their written work that they've completed during that time, they also have and can return to. So those can be valuable resources. And then for some people, like I've found, especially when I'm working with somebody with OCD, and we've done a week of work together, and they've learned lots of new skills, you know, it really helps to have somebody to be accountable to. Usually in that case, it's not going to be enough just to send me a form every month. They're probably going to find it helpful for a period of time, at least, to have somebody to check in with. And depending on the individual, that might be a therapist, or it might be you know, a support person or a support group. And so we always talk about that. Okay. And I'll make referrals as indicated. Right. One person asked me, what are the costs and benefits of basing your practice on intensive? So I thought I'd do a cost benefit analysis for myself. So this is for me, obviously. It would be different for each of you. But you know, I've found that for me, advantages of basing my practice on intensives is that I love that I can give individuals my full attention during the period of time that I'm working with them, that I'm not sort of going from one person to the next person to the next person, that like I can focus on one person, you know, for a whole week. That's really neat. It really suits my personality. I'm very focused. There's also minimal loss of momentum between sessions. And it's so rewarding when people do recover rapidly. Also, I love that I spend much less time writing notes than I used to. And I especially love that I no longer have to refill prescriptions or get prior authorization for medications. And it's also a lot easier to go on a real vacation without having to worry about coverage, because I just don't schedule anyone for an intensive when I want to go on a vacation. So that's really nice. There are some disadvantages, though, I have to say. So there is even more uncertainty and fluctuation in income than in my previous private practice. There's always been some, you know, uncertainty, busy times and less busy times. But it's sort of amplified when you're working with people with intensives. You have like really busy times and then really slow times, depending on, you know, yeah, hard to predict. Also, I miss that, you know, not everybody goes on to send me those emails. And so I don't always get that longer term follow-up, and so I miss that with people. And I feel like just as I've gotten close to someone, it's time to say goodbye. That's sad. And then of course there's the financial issue, which is real, that it's poorer coverage. There's also less time to course correct when you're working in such a short period of time. And there's less time for sort of practice and sort of sinking in between sessions. And I think sometimes the intensive treatment is not the right fit for someone if what they're needing is sort of to spend some time just sort of processing and practicing. Yeah, okay. But for me, I would say the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. Okay.
Amy, is it okay to ask a question from the chat that was sent to me real quick?
Oh, absolutely. So I just got to the questions part, so yeah.
Yeah, one person had said, from Amber, she says, "This is so wonderful. I have to log off, running to an appointment, but please let Amy know how much I appreciate all of this knowledge. And I will definitely follow up with watching the video." Another question from Marina is asking that she's not quite clear overall what an intensive is, and could you clarify? And I know you briefly touched on, like, sometimes you do like 2 hours or 4 hours a day with the client, but I'm wondering if you could share like what you had shared with me too, like according to certain severity of what you see the symptoms are, how you set up.
Yeah, you know what? I think I skipped over a slide by a mistake. I think I have a slide addressing that, and I must have, I'm still getting used to this new mouse that tends to be hyperactive. I think it might have skipped over one of my slides. Ah, here. Yeah, I missed this one. Right. So yeah, let me go through this and then I'll see if Marina still has questions. So yeah, so when I do that initial 30-minute screening consultation with someone, I try at that point to make an estimate as to what I think is probably going to be needed to make a real difference to that person. And you know, so in general, like if I'm working with somebody who's coming in with, you know, a pretty simple phobia, I'm going to, you know, there I'll probably recommend something like the duration of OST's one session treatment, as opposed to, you know, if I'm working with someone with you know, OCD or PTSD that's sort of more complex. There, I'm going to recommend sort of a minimum of total 20 hours. And I like to do that like 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. And when I'm doing it by teletherapy, and actually I think I would do this now that I think about it, if it were 5 days a week, I'd probably do break that up into two 2-hour sessions if I did it in person too. But definitely teletherapy, I'm breaking that up into two 2-hour sessions so that we have a break for lunch in between. I've learned that it helps to sort of you know, emphasize that that it's an estimate, that I can't be sure, you know, exactly how much time they'll end up wanting, and to offer flexibility whenever possible, to sort of offer the possibility of adding on more time if they'd like it at the end. Although I haven't had anybody decide that they, one person decided they wanted to add on more time. Okay. And then also, I want to make it really clear that the goal is not a complete cure. As I said, I haven't managed a complete cure for anyone. What I do want to help them do during the intensive is to learn basically how to break free from the cycle of avoidance or anxiety, or in the case of a hidden emotion, to sort of help them identify the hidden emotion and sort of know what to do to, and you know, to honor that, express that emotion, or act on that emotion. But I always emphasize that, you know, I'm going to sort of help them figure out sort of what to do, but then they're going to need to continue to practice after they meet with me. Yeah, when I'm doing, I think I already talked about what I do for teletherapy. I have done some in-person sessions for actually I've done, I guess, a maximum of 3-hour-long in-person sessions, and that again has been for the phobias. It's really helpful to have those longer sessions there to, you know, go all the way from you know, being terrified to be in the same room with a butterfly to holding the butterfly. And then yeah. Again, I usually meet with people on a daily, not a weekly basis. So, you know, it might be like 2 hours a day for 2 weeks, or 4 hours a day for a week. But it's going to be daily, so that we don't lose momentum. Okay. I hope that's the only slide I missed. Were there any other questions? I'll go back to the. And Marina, I wonder if that answers your question about what an intensive is.
While we're waiting on hearing from Marina, Mike is saying, thank you so much for sharing this information as well as your honesty regarding mistakes. I think that piece about you is just so refreshing, Amy. Is just that humanity and that we will make mistakes in this process, and that's how we've learned and grow too, right? But just really appreciating your transparency, your vulnerability. We've all been in the space where I think it's been painful that clients feel worse after the treatment. And even David Byrne says it'll work with about 80 to 90% of the population. So there's still kind of this pressure, I think, in the TEAM community to like get to cure for 100% of people by the end of it. And so it's just really refreshing to hear that honesty. And I think Mike's agreeing with that. He says, just learning from your mistakes, what you would do differently. That was so helpful. Bridget says, yes, just really great information, Amy. Yeah, thank you so much. Was there other questions for Amy in this process?
I'm going to stop sharing so that I can actually see people.
Yeah, and feel free to type it in or open your mic and ask too if you have a question. Okay, Jeannie's asking, this has been a wonderful training. Do people ever travel from out of state to see you? How does that all work legally when you're treating someone from out of state too?
Yeah, so far I haven't had anyone travel from out of state to see me. As I mentioned, I haven't really done much in the way of marketing. So maybe if I did, I'd have some more inquiries from people out of state. But yeah, I think I'm licensed really only to work with people who are located in the state of Maryland when I work with them. But it would be perfectly legal for somebody to sort of come to Maryland to work with me. Haven't done it yet.
Yeah, and I know from FGI where they do have like even people fly in from like Europe or something that there are still those state line restrictions for teletherapy, but if they are in your state lines physically, you can definitely move forward with the treatment that way. Yeah. Lee is asking, do you have a sense of a type of person or a type of problem that is especially well suited for intensives?
So I will say that, if we're aiming for sort of complete cure, I think the closest I've come has been with the simple phobias. The patients I've worked with there have really, sort of more than achieved what they were looking for in our work together, and had some really big successes. This approach definitely works really well with simple phobias, but even with the more complex things, I've found it a little bit hard to predict because some of the things that I would have thought would be reasons why somebody might be less likely to respond have not, like it hasn't panned out that way for me. So for example, I worked with someone with really severe OCD who was coming off of benzodiazepines, but still was on a pretty hefty dose of a benzodiazepine, and had a pretty severe history of childhood trauma. And she wanted to work with me on the OCD. And, I was thinking, I can probably help her some, but it's going to be probably, not going to make as good progress with her as I would with somebody with sort of a more straightforward or less, fewer comorbid issues, and not on benzodiazepines. But she was one of the people who had the most dramatic improvement. So she was just sort of on cloud nine at the end of our week together, that she was really no longer, she'd been engaged in a lot of cognitive compulsions, and she sort of got it, that she had agency over that, and could stop doing that. And that just really dramatically, she affected her level of anxiety. She was no longer anxious. And that was despite the history of childhood trauma and the benzodiazepines and everything. So it's a little hard to predict. So I guess the answer to that, Lee, is I'm still figuring that out.
Amy, I have a question.
Yeah.
So when you're doing a session that's like 2 hours or like you said, the longer sessions, can you just kind of walk through kind of what that session entails? Because I know that, sometimes our clients get tired, or sometimes like we get tired. Like how do you keep going during all that time, during such a lengthy session? What if you could just walk through a session that you've been through, that would be great.
So for the 2-hour sessions, which is really the longest that I do at a time by teletherapy, it's actually going to look a lot like, I don't know if you have listened to any of the Feeling Good podcasts that have the live sessions with David Burns that are around 2 hours long. It's going to look an awful lot like that. I feel that the sort of, I don't know, both the person I'm working with and I sort of get so much into the process of sort of moving, through empathy and agenda setting and into methods that it ends up not being exhausting. But I might refer you to listen to some of those, to the Feeling Good podcast and some of those live sessions, and that would really give you sort of a sense of how 2 hours can actually go really quickly, and not feel tiresome. With the longer, like 3-hour sessions with phobias, that also doesn't feel at all tiresome, because you're not sitting down. It's very active, right? You're constantly interacting with the person, sort of, so depending on what the thing is you're working on, getting closer to the butterflies, handling them. It's a lot of sort of active stuff. With when I worked with the person with the phobias of blood and of injections, we were, I was giving her injections, and she was giving herself finger pricks with a lancet, like people use for diabetes, and the whole thing is so active that somehow, I don't know, I don't find it at all exhausting. I don't know if that answered your question, Holly.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any other questions?
This is fantastic, Dr. Amy. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I think my question is, do you have like a structured like checklist as you're going through? Do this next, do this next, in like 1, 2, 3.
So actually, I don't really. So I've always got sort of T, E, A, and M in the back of my mind, and I'm sort of, I'm not doing T, E, A, M like that in a, because often you need to go back, you need to go back to A or back to E in the course of the process. But I'm always sort of thinking about things in those terms. But then when it comes to, because everybody's going to need something a little bit different, I find that if I try to do something like follow a checklist, it sort of gets in my way, because then I'm not sort of attuned to, okay, what's happening with this person right now and what do they need? I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does. I guess in terms of like the tools, do you already have kind of in your mind some of the tools that you want to use with the client?
Yeah, so again, I try not to get too attached to my ideas about which methods are probably going to work, but I do, sort of generate ideas of things that might work, and I also sort of get feedback on that from the person I'm working with. So I'll share with them, that I'm thinking of, this, that, and the other thing, all might be potential ways to sort of get at this. And, what do they think? What sounds promising or interesting to them? Because I find often if I sort of let them pick something, it's much more likely to be the right fit than if I sort of tell them which method we're going to use. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was so helpful. I've got like a couple of pages of notes. Thanks.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's good to see you here.
Amy, Jeannie has a question. Do you have a sense that intensives can work well for depression?
Yeah, so, as I'm sure you all know, sort of anxiety and depression often go hand in hand. And so I have worked with a number of people where it turned out that probably the sort of bigger issue was depression rather than, anxiety. I have found that there it sort of depends again on those issues of sort of outcome and process resistance. So somebody might come to me, like I had someone who came to me where it really looked like it was going to be sort of an issue of anxiety. She had a fear of making mistakes at work, and had actually not been going to work because she'd been sort of overwhelmed by this fear. But it actually turned out that sort of the bigger issue was depression. And actually, I think there was a hidden emotion that was the main thing. I think she would have been all on board maybe for doing some exposure to making mistakes at work, but she wasn't really at a place like sort of the depression actually was really important to her because to make a long story short, she wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. And her husband was saying that's sort of not okay. And I think the depression was sort of her way to be at home. And maybe, yeah. So, so it didn't really help her overcome her depression, but I think the intensive did give her some insight that was really important. About what was going on, and that it sort of wasn't really about the fear of making mistakes at work.
Yeah, that's great. And it looks like Andrew has his hand up as well.
Yeah, so my question, I suppose, it's not exactly promoting intensives, but sort of the opposite, really. Not all of us have the freedom for that. But have you gained any insights from your experience in intensive that if you had to go back to weekly sessions, you would apply those insights in the sort of more conventional model?
That's actually such a hard question, because I feel that sort of along with my switch to doing intensives has also been sort of getting so much more familiar with TEAM. So it's sort of hard to know what I would do differently going back, because I know TEAM a lot better, and what I'd be doing differently because of my experience with intensives. I mean, I think a lot of what I've learned from doing intensives would also be really helpful in the meeting with people weekly, emphasizing the fail as fast as you can from the very beginning, slowing down, sitting with open hands. Yeah, I think all of that would help me be more effective if I went back to weekly, meeting with people weekly as well.
Yeah, and even as I'm hearing you talk, Amy, my practice is still 100% weekly sessions, and I thought, like, I've been kind of lazy on like incorporating the front end stuff, like the easy diagnostics, and I did that with the one man that I did the intensive with, due to your suggestion, and just hearing you say like that ended up saving a lot of time. I found it so valuable with the one man that I did the intensive with. And I think that piece maybe would even make my weekly practice more effective, and maybe saves time in the long run, and not getting like a curveball of a problem that I didn't realize was present too. So yeah, many of those pieces I thought could be incorporated into the weekly.
Yeah, on the easy, those few questions about sort of asking about problems in relationships, like with, I don't know, with a spouse or a child, or there are those questions. I find that those have actually been really helpful to me too, in sort of alerting me to, potential hidden emotion related stuff that I might not have asked about if I hadn't sort of seen a problem with a certain family member checked off there.
Yeah. I really also like the wish list idea, and we could do that with weekly clients too, right? Like, let's get a thorough wish list of what they're really wanting to, what change looks like, what that will look like at the end of successful work together. So yeah, it is noon though, and just it looks like there's been a lot of gratitude and appreciation for this talk. Cynthia's giving you a round of applause and even a little dance here. Wait, let me see if there was anything else. Yeah, thank you so much. It's been very interesting and helpful. Yeah, so if you all need to log off, it is noon. Thank you so much for attending, for your time, and so much appreciation for Amy and generously sharing her time and knowledge with us as well. Michelle is saying, yes, thank you for sharing your experience. Very helpful plan. She's wanting to move forward with offering intensives. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. Oh, Steve is here. Thanks, Diane and Amy. Outstanding teaching on intensives. Love your genuine transparency. Yeah, I think that's one of Amy's superpower, actually, is her vulnerability and transparency, which is so refreshing. Yes, you will get the recording. Oh, and before people log off, I have a feedback form if you would be willing to share some feedback for Amy as well through that. I will email it out to everyone as well. Okay, I accidentally only sent it to Marina. Okay, so that is the feedback form there. And I will email the recording as well. Holly's asking where will the recording be? I'll email the recording to everyone who's registered. Julie saying many thanks, wonderful information for this new concept. Yeah, absolutely. It's new. It's kind of radical actually when we really look at how we typically perform therapy. And even after the one intensive I did, I even had a feeling like maybe the way we're doing things doesn't make sense. Like it isn't the most efficient or effective. And the whole concept really needs to change on how we approach treatment too. Yeah. Let me see if there was any other quick questions. Jeannie, this was so helpful. Love to do intensives at some point as well. You've inspired people, Amy.
Yeah.
Well, maybe she missed this. How comfortable were you with TEAM? At what level of certification were you before switching to fully doing intensives? Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, let me leave it at that one last question. Do you have the time for that, Amy, to
Yeah,
answer that before we wrap up?
Yeah. So I actually, before I made the switch, I had gotten to level 3 certification, but I've continued to do team related trainings constantly since then. So I feel that I've learned much more about team since I started than at the start of my work, both through practice and then through meeting with consultation groups, etc. Yeah,
It's a lifelong learning process, isn't it? With teams, sometimes I
absolutely.
continue to feel that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let me go ahead and close it here then. Just a huge thanks again, Amy, for everything that you've shared. Super valuable, all the nitty gritty, the setup. I thought I continued to learn from you today as well. And just really appreciating your generosity with your time. And thank you everyone else for attending and for all of your great questions and feedback too. Yeah, some are sending me direct messages and just saying thank you so much. It was valuable. Just really a productive time spent here. Yeah.
I'm so glad.
Okay. Yes. Well, have a great weekend, everyone. And thank you so much.
Thank you.